In the autumn of 1944, somewhere between the shattered villages of eastern France and the iron-cold forests of the German border, a name circulated among field hospitals and evacuation tents, a name that carried equal parts disbelief and dread. Staff Sergeant Robert Eugene Harlow, 2nd Armored Division, had lost his right arm below the elbow during a mortar assault near Nancy. The shrapnel had entered cleanly, severing muscle and bone in a matter of seconds. The field surgeon who performed the emergency amputation told him what every wounded man heard in that tent. "You're going home, soldier. Your war is over." But Robert Harlow did not go home. Within 3 weeks, he had refused evacuation orders twice. He had walked out of a rear echelon hospital in Epinal, still bandaged, still feverish, and returned to his unit on foot. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Brennan, tried to discharge him on medical grounds. Harlow refused to sign the papers. When asked why, he gave no grand speech. He said only, "I can still hold a rifle. I can still see. That's enough." The official record shows that Harlow remained with the 2nd Armored Division through November 1944, assigned to light duties, supply coordination, equipment checks, radio monitoring. But soldiers who served alongside him remember something else. They remember a man who moved through the winter trenches like a ghost, his empty sleeve pinned to his chest, his remaining hand always steady on whatever weapon he could carry. They remember that he never spoke about the arm. He never asked for sympathy. He simply stayed. And in the final week of November, near a nameless crossroads in the Vosges Mountains, Robert Harlow did something that no army manual had ever anticipated, no tactical doctrine had ever accounted for, and no medical board had ever imagined possible. He destroyed an enemy tank crew, alone, with one arm. What happened in those woods has been debated, mythologized, and partially erased by time. Some reports claim he ambushed a Panzer IV. Others say it was a Stuggy 3 assault gun. A few insist it was a captured French tank, repurposed by retreating German forces, but the essentials remain consistent across survivor testimony, military logs, and forensic examination of the wreckage found months later. One American soldier, severely disabled, armed with improvised weapons, killed or incapacitated an entire armored vehicle crew in close-quarters combat and walked away. This is not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of refusal. Refusal to accept the limitations imposed by injury, by doctrine, by the logic of survival itself. It is a story of what happens when the human will collides with the machinery of war and refuses to yield. The weather that November was merciless. Rain turned the forest floor into a soup of mud and decaying leaves. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters on most days. Radio communication became sporadic. Supply convoys were ambushed with increasing frequency as German forces, retreating but still dangerous, established defensive pockets throughout the mountain passes. The 2nd Armored Division had been tasked with clearing these pockets, one village at a time, one ridge at a time. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. Casualties were constant. Robert Harlow had been reassigned to a rear echelon checkpoint along a narrow logging road. His role was simple: monitor traffic, verify credentials, report anything unusual. It was the kind of assignment given to men who were no longer expected to fight, but Harlow treated it like a forward observation post. He kept a notebook where he recorded vehicle types, arrival times, and the condition of soldiers passing through. He collected discarded equipment, a broken bayonet, a half-empty ammunition belt, a smoke grenade with a faulty pin. He studied the terrain around the checkpoint, memorizing sight lines and cover points. He never explained why. Perhaps he didn't need to. On the morning of November 22, 1944, a German armored unit, likely a reconnaissance patrol or a remnants group separated from a larger retreat column, advanced through the forest toward the checkpoint. Intelligence reports had suggested enemy armor in the region, but specifics were scarce. The checkpoint was not fortified. It had no anti-tank weapons. It was staffed by 3 men: Harlow, a radio operator named Private First Class Dennis Kovac, and a logistics clerk named Corporal William Trent. Neither Kovac nor Trent had combat experience. When the sound of tank treads became audible through the trees, Trent froze. Kovac reached for the radio. Harlow reached for his rifle. The tank emerged from the fog like a steel apparition, low, angular, painted in the mottled camouflage of late-war desperation. It stopped approximately 60 meters from the checkpoint, engine idling. The turret rotated slowly, scanning. Inside, the crew would have been assessing the threat level. What they saw was a wooden hut, 2 panicked soldiers, and a one-armed man standing in the open with a rifle slung across his chest. What they did not see was the trap already forming in Robert Harlow's mind. He did not fire. He did not run. He turned to Kovac and said, in a voice described later as unnervingly calm, "Get to the trees. Take Trent. Don't come back until you hear nothing." Kovac hesitated. Harlow repeated the order, quieter this time. Kovac obeyed. He and Trent disappeared into the underbrush. The tank's turret stopped moving. The hatch remained closed. For a long moment, the forest held its breath. Then Robert Harlow walked toward the tank. Not quickly, not aggressively. He walked as if he were crossing a field to inspect a piece of farm equipment. His rifle hung loose. His left hand, his only hand, rested on the stock, but his finger was nowhere near the trigger. He stopped 10 meters from the hull, tilted his head slightly, and waited. The hatch opened. What followed in the next 7 minutes would later be reconstructed from ballistic evidence, scorch patterns, blood spatter analysis, and the testimony of Kovac, who watched from the tree line and saw only fragments through the fog. But the sequence, as best as military investigators could determine, unfolded like this. The commander, a young Oberleutnant, possibly still in his early 20s, emerged from the hatch to assess the lone soldier. He carried a sidearm, but did not draw it. He called out something in German. Harlow did not respond. The commander called out again, louder, more insistent. Harlow raised his left hand slowly, palm open, and spoke in English. "Engine trouble." The commander frowned. He leaned forward slightly, perhaps trying to understand the question, perhaps trying to determine if this was a ruse. In that moment of confusion, Harlow moved. He did not go for his rifle. Instead, he pulled the smoke grenade from his belt, the faulty one he had salvaged days earlier, and threw it underhand into the open hatch. The grenade did not detonate. It simply rolled inside, clattering against metal. The commander's eyes widened. He shouted a warning to the crew below. Harlow lunged forward. With his left hand, he grabbed the commander's tunic and pulled him halfway out of the hatch. The commander struck at him, landing a blow across Harlow's jaw. Harlow did not let go. He twisted his body, using his weight and momentum to yank the man fully out of the tank. They fell together onto the hull, grappling. The commander reached for his sidearm. Harlow drove his knee into the man's wrist, pinning the hand against the turret. With his remaining hand, he tore the pistol free and fired once, point blank into the open hatch. The shot ricocheted inside the crew compartment. Shouts erupted from below. Harlow rolled off the hull and dropped to the ground. He landed hard, the impact jarring his wounded arm. Pain radiated through his shoulder, but he did not stop. He crawled beneath the tank, between the treads, and positioned himself near the rear exhaust vent. The driver, panicking, threw the tank into reverse. The treads ground backward. Harlow pressed himself flat against the mud. The tank rolled over him, inches above his body, and stopped. The engine roared, belching black smoke. Harlow reached up, grabbed the exhaust grate, and pulled. The metal was scorching hot. His palm blistered instantly. He ignored it. He stuffed a piece of cloth, torn from his own uniform, into the vent and wedged it tight with the broken bayonet. The engine choked. Smoke began to pour into the crew compartment. The tank lurched forward, then stalled. Harlow crawled out from beneath it, gasping, covered in mud and oil. The side hatch burst open. A crewman stumbled out, coughing, disoriented. Harlow shot him twice with the commander's pistol. Another crewman emerged, this one armed with a submachine gun. Harlow dove behind a fallen tree. Bullets chewed through bark and wood. When the firing stopped, Harlow rose and threw the last object he had, a field canteen filled with gasoline he had siphoned from a wrecked jeep days earlier. It struck the open hatch and shattered. Liquid splashed across the turret. Harlow fired into the pooled fuel. The flames caught instantly. The remaining crew, 2 men, evacuated through the driver's hatch, both on fire, both screaming. They rolled in the mud, trying to extinguish themselves. Harlow walked toward them slowly, the pistol raised. He did not fire. He simply stood there, watching, as the fire consumed the tank and the men stopped moving. When Kovac and Trent returned, they found Robert Harlow sitting on a stump, staring at the burning wreckage. His hand was wrapped in a torn undershirt. His face was streaked with soot. He did not speak. He did not look at them. He simply sat, breathing as the steel cooled and the smoke rose into the grey sky. The war continued, but something in that forest had ended. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Brennan received word of the incident 3 hours after the smoke cleared. A radio transmission from the checkpoint, garbled and incomplete, mentioned enemy armor neutralized and Harlow engaged. Brennan assumed it was a miscommunication, perhaps a stray tank disabled by artillery, perhaps a crew that had surrendered. He did not expect what he found when he arrived at the site the following morning. The wreckage told a story that defied tactical logic. The tank, identified as a Sturmgeschütz III AUSF-G, a late-model assault gun used primarily for infantry support, had been immobilized not by external fire, but by suffocation. The exhaust system had been deliberately blocked, forcing toxic fumes back into the crew compartment. The internal fire had consumed most of the interior, but forensic traces remained. Blood on the turret rim, a spent pistol casing inside the hatch, scorch marks suggesting an accelerant had been introduced from outside. The bodies of 4 crew members were recovered. 2 had died from gunshot wounds. 2 had succumbed to smoke inhalation and burns. And sitting near the tree line, still holding the commander's sidearm, was Staff Sergeant Robert Eugene Harlow. Brennan ordered an immediate investigation. He interviewed Kovac and Trent separately. Their accounts matched. Harlow had engaged the tank alone, using improvised tactics and salvage materials. He had moved with deliberate intent, not desperation. He had not panicked. He had executed a plan no manual had taught him, no training had prepared him for, and no rational soldier with one arm should have been capable of completing. Brennan asked Harlow directly, "How did you do it?" Harlow's response, recorded in Brennan's personal log, was brief. "I didn't think about what I couldn't do. I thought about what they couldn't see." Brennan spent the next 48 hours deciding what to do with the report. Military protocol demanded that incidents involving improvised combat be documented in detail, especially when they resulted in enemy casualties. But Brennan understood something else. If this story reached higher command, it would raise questions that had no good answers. How had a severely disabled soldier been allowed to remain in a combat zone? Why had he not been evacuated? What did it say about the medical discharge process if a one-armed man could kill an armored crew more effectively than a trained infantry squad? Brennan wrote 2 versions of the report. The first, intended for official record, stated that enemy armor had been engaged and destroyed by checkpoint personnel using standard defensive measures. No names were mentioned. No details of method were included. It was filed, stamped, and forgotten. The second version, kept in Brennan's personal files, contained everything: the blocked exhaust, the gasoline canteen, the close-quarters pistol engagement, the smoke grenade ruse. At the bottom, Brennan added a handwritten note: "This man should not have been here, but I am glad he was." That second report was never submitted. It remained in Brennan's possession until his death in 1973, at which point it was donated to a military archive in Maryland. It was rediscovered in 1998 by a graduate student researching unconventional tactics in World War II. By then, Robert Harlow had been dead for 11 years. The tank itself was stripped for salvage within a week. The hull was too damaged to repair, but components, transmission gears, drive wheels, armor plates, were catalogued and repurposed. The vehicle's identification number was recorded, but no follow-up investigation was conducted into how it had been destroyed. In the chaos of late 1944, with hundreds of tanks being lost or abandoned on both sides, one more wreck in the Vosges Mountains warranted no special attention. But among the soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division, the story spread. It was told in hushed voices around fires, in supply tents, during long night watches. Details shifted with each retelling. Some said Harlow had used a flamethrower, others claimed he had rigged explosives. A few insisted he had climbed onto the tank and strangled the crew one by one. The truth, as documented in Brennan's hidden report, was both simpler and more disturbing. He had used their confusion, their hesitation, and their assumption that a one-armed man posed no threat. He had weaponized their disbelief. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We are interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. What drives a man to fight when every physical indicator tells him to stop? What internal mechanism refuses to acknowledge the reality of injury, of irreversible loss, of statistical improbability? Military psychologists who later reviewed Harlow's case, though only through incomplete documentation, struggled to categorize his behavior. He did not fit the profile of a glory seeker. He had no history of reckless conduct. He had not volunteered for dangerous assignments before his injury. If anything, his service record was unremarkable, competent, disciplined, neither distinguished nor problematic. The amputation should have been the end. For 97% of soldiers who lost a limb in World War II, it was. They were evacuated, treated, and discharged. Some adapted, some did not. But they left the battlefield. Robert Harlow was part of the remaining 3%, the ones who stayed. And within that 3%, he was an outlier, even among outliers. Dr. Helena Voss, a military psychologist who studied trauma and resilience in combat veterans during the 1950s, wrote extensively about what she called refusal adaptation, the phenomenon of soldiers who, after severe injury, exhibited not resignation but heightened determination to remain functional. Her research identified 3 common traits among this group. Externalized identity. They defined themselves not by what they had lost, but by what they could still contribute. Hypercompetence compensation. They developed exaggerated skill in remaining abilities to offset deficits, moral inversion of victimhood. They rejected sympathy as a form of disempowerment and reframed injury as irrelevant to duty. Robert Harlow embodied all 3. He never spoke about his missing arm except in logistical terms. He practiced rifle handling with his left hand obsessively to the point where other soldiers noticed calluses forming in unusual patterns. And when offered light-duty assignments, he treated them not as relief, but as insult, an implication that he was no longer capable of real work. But Voss also identified a darker pattern among these men. Many did not survive long after the war. Suicide rates were disproportionately high, so were rates of alcoholism, social isolation, and violent outbursts. The mechanism that had allowed them to function under impossible conditions, the refusal to accept limitation, often became pathological in peacetime. Without the war to justify their refusal, they turned that refusal inward, against themselves. Harlow's post-war life would follow this pattern with grim precision. In the days immediately following the tank engagement, Harlow was quietly transferred to a different unit. Brennan had made the decision without consulting higher command: keep him in the division, but move him away from the front line. The official reason given was administrative reassignment. The real reason was that Brennan feared what would happen if Harlow remained in active combat. Not because he might be killed, though that risk was present, but because he might do something even more reckless, something that could not be hidden in a private report. Harlow accepted the reassignment without comment. He was stationed at a logistics depot near Metz, tasked with inventory management and vehicle maintenance coordination. It was the kind of work designed to keep a man busy without exposing him to danger. For 2 weeks, Harlow performed the duties mechanically, efficiently, and without complaint. Then, on December 8, 1944, he disappeared. A search was conducted. His bunk was empty. His rifle was missing. His personal effects, letters from home, a pocket Bible, a single photograph of a woman whose identity was never confirmed, remained untouched. Kovac, who had been transferred to the same depot, reported that Harlow had mentioned unfinished work the night before, but had provided no details. 3 days later, Harlow reappeared. He walked into the depot commander's office, returned his rifle, and reported for duty. When asked where he had been, he said only, "Patrol." The commander, a captain named Richard Soames, did not press the issue. He filed no report. He simply sent Harlow back to work. But rumors circulated. A German patrol had been found dead near the Belgian border, their weapons missing, their bodies arranged in a line, as if for inspection. A supply convoy had been ambushed, its cargo recovered, its attackers never identified. A bridge demolition team had reported assistance from an unknown American soldier who had helped place charges, then vanished before the detonation. None of these incidents were officially connected to Harlow. None could be proven. But soldiers talk, and patterns emerge, and the name Robert Harlow began to carry a different weight. Less admiration, more unease. Dr. Voss, in her later writings, described this as post-injury hyperagency, the compulsive need to assert control and effectiveness after experiencing profound helplessness. For Harlow, the loss of his arm had created a void that could only be filled by continued action, continued proof that he was still whole. The tank engagement had not satisfied that need, it had intensified it. He was, in the clinical sense, still fighting the moment of amputation. Every subsequent action was an argument against that moment, a refusal to let it define him. And like all arguments conducted through violence, it had no logical endpoint. It could only escalate until something, or someone, stopped it. The war in Europe ended 5 months later. Robert Harlow was honorably discharged in June 1945. He returned to the United States, to a small town in Pennsylvania, to a family that no longer recognized the man who came home. He worked briefly in a steel mill, then as a night watchman, then not at all. He drank. He fought. He was arrested twice for disorderly conduct. He wrote letters to the Veterans Administration requesting reassignment to active duty. The requests were denied. In 1951, at the age of 32, Robert Eugene Harlow died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a rented room above a hardware store. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as suicide. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary noting his military service and the loss of his arm. No mention was made of the tank. No mention was made of what he had done in those woods. The war had ended, but for Robert Harlow, it had never stopped. To understand how a one-armed man destroyed an armored vehicle, one must first understand the vulnerabilities of late-war German armor. By November 1944, the Wehrmacht's logistical situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Fuel shortages were chronic, spare parts were scarce. Crew training had been condensed from months to weeks. Tanks that would have been retired for mechanical issues were pressed into service with known defects. The Sturmgeschütz III that Harlow engaged was almost certainly operating under suboptimal conditions. low fuel, reduced crew, possibly inadequate maintenance. But even a compromised tank is a formidable weapon. The WWII had armor plating thick enough to deflect small arms fire. It mounted a 75mm gun capable of destroying buildings. Its crew, even if inexperienced, would have been trained in basic defensive protocols. Under normal circumstances, a lone infantryman, let alone a disabled one, would have no chance of success. Harlow's advantage was not physical, it was cognitive. He understood something fundamental about armored warfare that many soldiers did not. A tank is not a fortress. It is a sensory deprivation chamber. Visibility is limited to narrow slits and periscopes. Auditory awareness is drowned out by engine noise. Communication between crew members relies on intercom systems that often malfunction. The crew is isolated, vulnerable to disorientation, and dependent on the assumption that external threats will behave predictably. Harlow behaved unpredictably. When he approached the tank unarmed and non-threatening, he violated the crew's threat assessment protocols. The commander emerged, not because he saw an opportunity to capture a prisoner, but because the situation did not compute. A one-armed soldier standing in the open with no visible weapon and no apparent fear does not fit into any tactical model. It suggests either surrender or mental incapacity. Either way, it invites investigation rather than immediate violence. That moment of confusion, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 5, was all Harlow needed. By the time the commander realized the threat, Harlow was already inside his decision-making loop. The smoke grenade, even though inert, created panic. The crew could not know it was faulty. They could only react to the possibility of chemical or incendiary threat. That reaction, shouting, scrambling, evacuation preparation, created chaos inside the compartment. Chaos is the enemy of coordination, and coordination is what keeps a tank crew alive. The blocked exhaust was not sophisticated engineering, it was opportunism. Harlow had observed vehicle maintenance procedures for weeks. He knew that the WWII's engine relied on unobstructed airflow for cooling and exhaust expulsion. He knew that the vent grate could be manually accessed from below. He knew that even temporary obstruction would force fumes back into the crew space. He did not need to kill the engine. He only needed to make the interior unlivable long enough for the crew to evacuate. The gasoline accelerant was improvised field chemistry. Soldiers in World War II routinely carried flammable liquids for emergency purposes, starting fires in wet conditions, sterilizing equipment, improvised signaling. Harlow had repurposed a supply intended for survival into a weapon. When the canteen shattered against the hull, the vapor cloud that formed was dense enough to ignite from a single spark. The pistol shot provided that spark. The fire that followed was not an explosion. It was sustained combustion, fed by residual fuel inside the tank and the oxygen-rich environment of the open hatches. Forensic analysis of the wreck, conducted months later, revealed burn patterns consistent with external ignition rather than internal fuel tank rupture. This suggested that the fire had been deliberately set, not caused by combat damage. But without a surviving crew to interrogate, the exact sequence could not be confirmed. The official conclusion was that the vehicle had been destroyed by unknown means. The possibility that a single soldier had engineered the destruction through improvisation and close-quarters aggression was considered, then dismissed as implausible. Yet the evidence remained. A disabled tank, a dead crew, and a one-armed man who had walked away. Tactical manuals, written after the war, began to address this kind of engagement, what modern military doctrine calls asymmetric close-quarters armor engagement. But in 1944, no such doctrine existed. Soldiers were taught to avoid tanks unless equipped with specialized weapons, bazookas, anti-tank mines, satchel charges. The idea that a man with no heavy weapons and a permanent physical disability could neutralize armor was not part of any training curriculum. Harlow had invented his own curriculum. He had studied the machines, understood their weaknesses, and exploited them with whatever tools were available. He had not relied on strength or speed. He had relied on observation, timing, and the willingness to do what the enemy did not expect. In this sense, his victory was not physical, it was intellectual. He had outthought a tank crew, and in the brutal calculus of war, that was enough. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. For 34 years, the full details of Robert Harlow's engagement remained buried, not classified, not redacted, simply forgotten. The official record listed him as a decorated veteran who had served honorably despite injury. The Medal of Honor was never awarded. The Silver Star was never considered. No commendation appeared in his file beyond a standard Purple Heart for the loss of his arm. When he died in 1951, his obituary mentioned military service, but nothing extraordinary. He was remembered, if at all, as another casualty of war, one who had survived the battlefield only to succumb to the aftermath. But documents do not disappear completely. They linger in archives, in personal collections, in the margins of other stories, and sometimes, decades later, they resurface. In 1985, a researcher named Thomas Kellerman was conducting oral history interviews with veterans of the 2nd Armored Division for a project on unconventional tactics in the European theater. One of his interviewees, a former logistics clerk named Dennis Kovac, mentioned a one-armed sergeant who killed a tank. Kellerman assumed it was a misremembered anecdote, perhaps a conflation of multiple events. But Kovac insisted. He provided dates, locations, and the name, Robert Harlow. Kellerman began digging. He found Harlow's service record, which confirmed the amputation and the discharge date, but provided no details of combat actions. He contacted the National Archives and requested any incident reports from the 2nd Armored Division during November 1944. Most had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1973. But a handful survived, including a brief entry from Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Brennan's unit log: checkpoint engagement, enemy armor neutralized, minimal friendly casualties. No names, no methods, just the fact of an event. Kellerman then tracked down Brennan's surviving family. Brennan had died in 1973, but his widow had donated his personal papers to a military history archive. Among those papers was the second report, the one Brennan had never submitted. Kellerman requested access. It took 2 years of bureaucratic negotiation before the archive agreed to release the document. When Kellerman finally read it, he understood why Brennan had kept it hidden. The report was not merely a tactical after-action summary, it was a moral document. Brennan had written in precise military language a description of something that should not have been possible. And in doing so, he had posed a question that no one in 1944 wanted to answer. What do we do with soldiers who refuse to stop? Kellerman published his findings in 1988 in a small military history journal. The article, titled "Improvised Armor Engagement by a Disabled Combatant, a Case Study from the Vosges, 1944, received minimal attention. A few historians cited it. A few veterans wrote letters to the journal, some confirming similar stories, others dismissing it as exaggeration. The broader public never saw it. Robert Harlow remained unknown, but in 1998, the article was rediscovered by a documentary filmmaker named Laura Pritchett, who was researching stories of invisible heroes, soldiers whose actions had been overlooked or deliberately suppressed. She reached out to Kellerman, now retired, and requested permission to feature Harlow's story in her film. Kellerman agreed, on the condition that the focus remain on the facts, not sensationalism. Pritchett interviewed surviving members of Harlow's unit. She visited the site in France, where the engagement had occurred, now an unmarked stretch of forest, indistinguishable from thousands of others. She obtained declassified German records that confirmed the loss of a Stugee-3 assault gun in that region on November 22, 1944, cause listed as unknown. She hired a forensic historian to analyze the timeline, the methods, and the plausibility. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. It had happened. A one-armed American soldier had destroyed an enemy tank crew, alone. The documentary aired on a regional cable channel in 1999. It received positive reviews, but limited viewership. A short segment was uploaded to the internet in the early 2000s, where it accumulated a modest following among military history enthusiasts. And then, gradually, it faded again. Robert Harlow's grave is in a small cemetery in Pennsylvania. The headstone lists his name, his dates of service, and the words, "faithful unto death." There is no mention of the tank, no mention of the arm, no mention of what he did in those woods. In 2017, a group of French veterans and historians placed a small plaque near the site of the engagement. It reads, in French and English, "Here, an American soldier defied the impossible. November 1944. No name is given, the location is approximate. The plaque itself is weathered and easily missed. But it exists. Archives are not neutral. They do not simply preserve, they select. And in the case of Robert Harlow, the selection process had been clear. His story was too uncomfortable, too anomalous, too difficult to reconcile with the narratives of heroism and sacrifice that defined post-war memory. He was not the right kind of hero. He was broken, he was angry, he was inconvenient, so he was quietly erased. But erasure is never complete. Documents survive, witnesses remember, and eventually someone asks the right question. Thomas Kellerman died in 2003. In his personal papers, found after his death, was a handwritten note: "We do not honor the ones who refuse to quit. We honor the ones who quit gracefully. Harlow did neither. That is why he matters." The note was never published. It remains in a university archive, filed under miscellaneous correspondence. Like Harlow himself, it waits for someone to find it. There is a photograph, rarely seen, taken in early 1945. It shows a group of soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division standing beside a wrecked German assault gun. The vehicle's turret is scorched black. The hull is pocked with shrapnel scars. In the foreground, barely visible, is a figure with his right arm in a sling, or rather no right arm at all. The sleeve is pinned. The man's face is turned away from the camera. He is not posed. He is not celebrating. He is simply there, among the others, indistinguishable except for the missing limb. The photograph was discovered in 2011 in a private collection donated to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. The donor, a nephew of Dennis Kovac, had inherited a box of wartime memorabilia. Among the items was this photo with a handwritten caption on the back: "Harlow, Noverin 44. No other context, no explanation, just a name, a date, and an image of a man who had done something no one else had. The photograph raises a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Why did Robert Harlow do it? He had no tactical obligation. He could have retreated with Kovac and Trent. He could have radioed for support. He could have waited for the tank to pass or for reinforcements to arrive. The checkpoint was not strategically vital. The tank posed no immediate threat to a larger objective. By any rational measure, engaging it alone was pointless. But rationality is not the language of war. War speaks in necessity, in survival, in the refusal to accept powerlessness. And for Robert Harlow, the tank was not just an enemy vehicle, it was a symbol. It represented everything that had tried to stop him: the shrapnel, the amputation, the medical boards, the reassignments, the unspoken assumption that he was no longer capable. The tank was the physical embodiment of limitation itself, and so he destroyed it. This interpretation is, of course, speculative. Harlow left no diary, no letters explaining his motivations. He gave no interviews after the war. The few who spoke with him before his death described a man who was distant, guarded, and unwilling to discuss the past. When asked directly about the war, he would change the subject. When pressed, he would leave the room. The trauma was not in what he said. It was in what he refused to say. Dr. Helena Voss, in her final work before her death in 1984, wrote, "Some soldiers fight because they believe in a cause. Others fight because they have no choice. But a few fight because fighting is the only language their pain understands. These are the ones we lose, even when they survive." Robert Harlow was one of these. The tank engagement did not save him. It did not redeem him. It did not heal him. If anything, it accelerated his decline. Because once the war ended, once the enemy was no longer external, he had no way to articulate the violence still churning inside him. He had no tank to destroy. He had only himself. And in 1951, in a rented room above a hardware store, he did what he had done in the forest. He acted with precision, with finality, and with the terrible clarity of someone who had stopped fighting fate, and instead embraced it. The coroner's report was brief. No note was found. No explanation was offered. The weapon, a service revolver he had kept despite discharge regulations, was placed in evidence, then eventually destroyed. His body was buried with military honors, a folded flag presented to a sister who barely remembered him. A few veterans attended. Fewer spoke. And then silence. But steel does not forget. The wreck of that Stuggy 3, salvaged and melted down, became part of post-war reconstruction. Its molecules were reforged into railroad tracks, factory beams, construction girders. Somewhere in Europe, perhaps in France, perhaps in Germany, a piece of that tank still exists. It bears no scars, it carries no memory, but it was there. It was part of the moment when a one-armed man refused to be erased. War archives are filled with stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of men who did extraordinary things under impossible conditions. But they are also filled with silences, gaps where names should be, where actions should be recorded, where the full weight of what happened should rest. Robert Harlow exists in one of those gaps, not forgotten, but not fully remembered, not celebrated, but not dismissed. He is a reminder that war does not end cleanly. It does not resolve. It does not offer closure. It leaves fragments, a photograph, a report, a plaque in a forest, a man who destroyed a tank and then destroyed himself. The steel remembers, even if we do not, and perhaps that is enough. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Robert Eugene Harlow. See you in the next video.